This event is sponsored by Miro. Miro is the online whiteboard platform where product teams can work together effectively. If you don't know where to start, it's packed with over 50 templates for product teams. Whether you need a Kanban, mind map, retrospective, product roadmap, or user story map, we've got you covered. Try it for free.
Some time ago, I joined a company as director of product. It was for an enterprise service with a very complicated value proposition and a lot of complexity. I inherited an existing team and a bunch of open recs to build out that team. We were brainstorming how we might be able to improve lead generation and trial behaviors so we could get more of our potential customers experiencing the product before they purchased it. During one of the brainstorming sessions, one of the C-suite level leant over and said to me, "I have a straw man for you." He then proceeded to articulate a very specific solution that he'd been thinking about based on his conversations with customers, based on his intuition of the market. Noted, I added that to the hopper among all the other ideas that we'd been considering. However, over the next couple of weeks, he kept on coming back to that same specific solution, asking how had we been thinking about implementing it, what had we done to evolve it, and even when we were even going to deliver it. This took me by surprise. One of my existing team members approached me, having a lot of experience working with this guy, said, when he suggests a straw man, he's not really suggesting. He's expecting you to implement what he wants. I was surprised, but new to the company, needing to build relationships, and recognizing that he had a much better understanding of the customer and the market than I did at that point in time, I duly adopted the solution. It did not sit that well with me. I was wondering, have we done enough validation? What were the risks? Is this really the right solution for the problem at hand? More so, it worried me about what kind of team culture I was going to be creating if we simply adopted what stakeholders were wanting us to implement. Needless to say, it actually did not work. While it created a lot more leads for the product, most of those leads were highly unqualified, and this very much frustrated the sales team and did not lead to greater revenue. I'd fallen into the trap of authority bias. Here's a much more famous example. Milgram's obedience experience in Yale in 1961, where a perceived authority figure instructed a subject to shock his recipients. The shocks were fake, but that was not known to the subjects, who always blindly obeyed. In the context of product management, authority bias, and I'll define my definition of authority bias, is when a manager, key customer, or other person in a position of power or expertise, perceived or real, may assert information to be true or a course of action to be the correct path. The tendency is to skip a critical assessment of their directive, perhaps out of deference for their authority, over eagerness to please them, an assumption that they must have all the facts, or even out of fear. So, having fallen into that trap myself, what is a good PM to do? Well, I set about gathering data to understand how authority bias and other biases might actually impact us as product managers in the workplace. I've done a study researching with a bunch of product managers across companies and across industries, surveying their perception and their experiences with biases in the workplace. And I'd like to share some of that data with you today. It's still early days, so I'll be sharing some trends, and I hope to be able to give you an update at some point. So the first statistic that jumped out at us was that 60% of product managers said that they experienced authority bias often or always. A third of them believed that their companies handle it quite poorly. That is, that they did not feel in a position to be able to push back or to mitigate that authority bias. 95% of product managers admitted that they've fast-tracked a product feature not because of the value it would create for the business or their customers, but because of who was asking for it. Half of them often accommodate ad hoc requests late in the development, when often they'll skip any critical assessment that may have occurred had those been surfaced earlier on in the planning phases. And often the product managers do not actually believe those features are necessary. And 2 out of 3 product managers surveyed agreed that senior stakeholders' opinions ruled the day when it came to deciding product priorities, despite product managers' nominal responsibility for making those decisions. The good news is that about 50% of product managers, and this number seems to be increasing, feel comfortable and empowered to challenge a senior member of their organization. I'll give you an example of where I overcame authority bias working for a customer. The situation was quite simple. I was working with a sizable social networking application. It was a niche application. They'd been very successful in acquiring their customers in their target audience. They had millions of daily active users. Those daily active users on average spent over 90 minutes a day with the application. Pretty impressive. About 400,000 of those users had been upsold into a premium version, each spending well over $100 a year on the application. A pretty nice little business. The problem is that they had not been able to refresh that product for over 2 years. That's why they asked me to join and help them. The root cause of that issue was that the Stakeholder, who was the CEO and founder, who'd actually founded the company because he had the exact problem he was trying to solve, so very much saw himself as the customer. Every decision on prioritization and features and all design decisions were basically channeled through him to make those calls. This created a lot of churn and a lot of slow decision making. And because they'd also spent over 2 years to deliver a product, there was a massive pent-up demand for new features and feature enhancements. And so there was an excessively long backlog that was putting a lot of stress on the situation. So what did we do to solve the problem? Well, as a highly intuitive decision maker basing a lot of his decisions based on gut, we decided to first balance his decision making with voice of the customer through qualitative data that we'll gather from talking to users on a regular basis. Now, he was also very concerned about us embarking on deep user research that would be very time consuming, that would potentially slow the team down even further. So we kept it very simple. We did weekly validation of only 5 users each week. We would minimally prepare for it using whatever assets or documentation or product that we had been building. So we'd be able to basically talk about issue du jour, and whatever we were able to gather from that would become directionally useful to balance out that conversation with the stakeholder. Secondly, to unblock this long period of time of no releases and to add more quantitative data to the assessment, we embarked on a 3-stage beta where, rather than take a big risk of deploying a product to a whole big user base, we simply chose 1,000 users and then in a focused way deployed incremental betas and really tested out what the product was doing. This allowed us also to change the conversation from being at the feature level and the design level to one about driving outcomes and metrics. We set a set of KPIs and a bunch of countermetrics where we agreed on certain tolerances. These countermetrics, for example, like if revenues were dropping, or if our premium conversion rate was dropping, or if engagement levels were lower. But so long as they stayed within tolerances, we had pre-agreed to allow the team just keep on moving forward. What were the results? Well, the team immediately felt empowered to challenge the opinion of the stakeholder and be able to balance that with both qualitative and quantitative data. We massively de-scoped a lot of those secondary features because now we had a lot more data to suggest that they were not even necessary. And we relaunched the product within 3 months and even received a revenue lift as a result of that. In World War II, aircraft losses were high. To reduce losses, the Allied forces studied planes that returned from battle to discern additional armor placements. They were looking at the wingtips, around the cabin, the tail, and decided that was where additional armor needed to be added. But they hadn't factored in the damage on planes that didn't return. By neglecting bullet holes on lost planes, they missed armoring planes' most vulnerable areas around their engines. This is a form of survivor bias. In the context of product management, I define survivor bias is a common flaw bedeviling customer research, user behavioral analytics, and user testing in particular, to concentrate your efforts on those most active with your product. Those users are generally more positive about your product. Active users are generally more visible, more easily reached, and more typically responsive, and therefore are overrepresented in your collected data. A good example of this is if you're thinking about bringing customers through an onboarding and adoption process, many users will drop out through that process, sometimes as quickly as a couple of minutes. They're much, much harder to speak to than those users that have reached all the way through the end of the adoption process and are actively using your product, probably very positive about your product. Yet you aren't talking to those users about that didn't make it through, about why they didn't find your product valuable and usable. So when setting about trying to understand more about survivor bias in product management, we did some survey and broke that survey into consumer apps and enterprise to see if there was any differences. And here are some of the results. When informing product prioritization decisions for consumer apps, by far the number one input is the behavioral analytics of current users of the product. And that's probably the way it should be. There's a wealth of data. They are obviously very active users, very important users, but it's insufficient. Secondly, primary market research and the senior executives' own and stakeholders' own opinions were also very important inputs. However, only 1 in 3 identified disengaged users or elapsed customers, those no longer using the product, as a top 3 source to inform product prioritization decisions. And almost 60% admitted that they had rarely or never interviewed a dissatisfied customer. Enterprise applications didn't fare so well either. Unsurprisingly, the number one input to inform product prioritization decisions was listening to direct requests from existing, highly motivated customers, often the largest customers. Very few, 2 in 3, actually ranked user behavioral analysis of the end user in the bottom 3. That is that they were listening a lot to the economic buyer to prioritize their product prioritization decisions, but not necessarily understanding how end users were using the product and improving their satisfaction, and therefore only made investments in those areas occasionally. Only 12% reported disengaged or elapsed customers, again, no longer using the product, maybe cancelled the product, to be a top 3 source for informing their prioritization decisions. This is a form of survivor bias. Here's an example of how I overcame survivor bias in the workplace. I was working as a consultant with a franchisee management system. Now, a franchisee management system is quite complicated, not going to go into too much detail, but to suffice to say that it allowed a franchise and a set of franchisees to communicate more effectively with each other, to standardize and roll out processes, to manage their brand, to ensure the consistent operational practices across the franchise, and to manage supply chain and inventory. Very complicated product, and this company had done a pretty good job of acquiring a lot of users. They were very much, customers. They were very much a sales-driven culture. They had, however, focused more on the smaller fry, the longer tail, the single location and few location customers rather than the larger customers. The CEO founder of that company had himself been a franchisee, and so he really understood the pain of managing a franchise and had wanted to ensure that a core value of his company was to ensure that the team also felt that pain and that they had what he called extreme responsiveness. This was a great value, and they actually were very disciplined in how they would assess incoming requests and making sure that any of those requests that they responded to were done in a way that would help all of their customers improve. Unfortunately, it meant that almost all of the resources were always focused on those urgent incoming requests from their existing customers, and less was done on investing for the future, such as breaking into new markets or to understand what kind of features might delight customers and perhaps break into entirely new segments. The solution was first to actually focus on a particular segment that we wanted to own, that maybe we had made some inroads into, but we couldn't exclusively focus on just the existing customers. We had to understand more new needs of that larger segment. This was the home services market. Think plumbers, electricians, contractors for your home. We had to encourage churn for the existing high touch but low revenue customers to help them find alternative solutions than our own product. This was very, very painful. To ensure that we balanced against that sales-driven culture and didn't fall into the same trap again, is we really elevated the adoption and engagement metric of our target customer segment to ensure that that was a key metric that the company tracked and embraced, to ensure that anything that we sold would ultimately deliver against, be valuable to that customer segment. Secondly, we developed a portfolio management framework which allowed us to, of course, still be very responsive to incoming customer requests. You've always got to be able to do that, to be able to be to make iterative improvements to improve your relationship with existing customers. However, we also made sure that we carved off resources to invest in customer delighting features that will allow us to capture the attention of our target segment, as well as invest in that core platform to ensure technical debt removal and that the platform would scale as the company grew. What was the solution? What was the outcome? Well, within just 1 quarter, we had reoriented the entire roadmap around this home services roadmap market and reoriented the platform to serve their needs. Secondly, we had landed 2 beachhead, large-scale referenceable customers that allowed us to have, as a case study, the ability to talk to more and more of our target market with real experience and credibility under our belt. We had also shrunk that single client base quite dramatically. However, the pivot came too late and the company ran out of runway. Google's Project Aristotle is a landmark study of teamwork and team performance. Started in 2012 and completed in 2015, it identified 5 critical factors for team success. They were dependability, whether or not you can actually rely on your team members and hold them accountable. Structure and clarity. Is the process clear? Are the roles clear? Do you know your goals? The meaning of the work. To me personally, how meaningful is this work in my own motivations? The impact of the work. Is this work impacting the business and driving customer outcomes? And finally, psychological safety. How safe is it in my team environment to take a risk without being ridiculed? By far, the study showed that psychological safety was the most important factor for team success. To define that, coined by Harvard professor Amy Edmondson, psychological safety is a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. You're confident that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. The absence of psychological safety creates reputation risk. In the context of product management, the absence of psychological safety is once you propose and communicate support for approach, you become personally invested and personally connected to that. It is very easy to fall in love with your idea, called the halo effect, or you may see the failure of something you've supported as a reflection of your personal failings. You become defensive and inflexible. you reject data that contradicts your belief, or the team just takes fewer risks in the first place. I said about trying to understand how psychological safety or reputation risk might actually affect how well teams operate and how well they learn. So we asked this question. I would describe my company as one where failure is embraced as learning and taking risks is actively encouraged. Well, I was encouraged to see that 60% of product managers reported that they felt that their company was very much like that. However, 23% of product managers reported that that was not the case. So again, we have a ways to go. When trying to understand the underlying behaviors that learning teams have over, psychological safe learning teams have over other teams, we notice some interesting trends. For a start, they are very comfortable challenging others at all levels of seniority and stakeholders, peers and directs when they have doubts. Secondly, these teams tend to prototype and validate and iterate towards a solution rather than build towards a very specific solution they have in mind from the outset. Third, they're prepared to roll back or slow down when a product release is not actually hitting their business metrics, not just if there's a technical failure, but if there's some concern on the business side. They hold regular retrospectives or 5 ways to constantly improve how they're working together in very safe and open conversation. And they celebrate things even when they don't work out. They see failure as a learning opportunity. So here's an example of how I overcame reputation risk in the workplace. Now, reputation bias can emerge in very, very subtle ways. It does not need to manifest itself through outright fear or false representation of outcomes. It can appear as defensiveness or resistance to feedback. But at its most subtle, it can go unmasked for some time, only showing up when the outcomes you're seeking are not being delivered on. It can be deeply cultural. It can manifest in how the team works, communicates, and takes risks. Here's one such case. I was working for a subscription business, fairly large, and we were really focused on growth. And so I constituted a growth team that would really focus on driving higher conversion rate from our visitors through to paid subscriptions. That team was given a very high visible conversion rate optimization goal, OKR. Historically, however, the company had been fairly top-down and a fairly low trust environment. Now, the company had been around for a long time, so undoing that is difficult. Myself as a product leader I was very much trying to address that, but I was going to take some time. As a result, the team tended to only try safe ideas. Every idea they felt had to work. Furthermore, they were very sensitive to affecting any user's experience, and so testing tended to be limited to a few % of users at any point in time, which meant that we learned a lot slower than we could. As a result, after 3 to 6 months, we'd only marginally improved against our goal, even below the investment of the team, to the extent that we were actually thinking of disbanding the team entirely. The solution? Well, counterintuitively, taking that big, lofty goal off the table was an important step, and instead replacing it with the kind of behaviors, a goal to drive the kind of behaviors that we wanted to see, that we thought would get us there towards the goal. We replaced it with that. In particular, we emphasized test velocity. Think of at-bats, like the more swings you take, the more likely you're going to hit something. And idea mix. So the idea being that we want to see both the easy wins, the smaller incremental gains, but also a good mix of bigger, higher risk ideas. We then worked in several retreats at really building out and reinforcing a new team culture or ways of working. This included helping them switch their brainstorming process from being very much about like critique and trying to assess which ideas would work to just going for volume and getting as many ideas on the table as possible. We emphasize learning as an outcome over the actual business outcome, and made sure that learning would be celebrated whether or not there was a success or failure. And we agreed on some product principles that we would work by, including being very hypothesis driven with everything we did, that valuing speed and iteration and quick decision making above all else, and that failure was okay. The results? Wow. We built a lot of confidence and momentum in the team very, very quickly. Both the throughput of what they were delivering and the breadth of those ideas, being both the smaller and the larger ideas, were both increased dramatically. And we hit our goal. Now, I'll say it was impossible necessarily to change the org culture overnight, but we could actually address, it was well within our realm to be able to address that team environment. So, in conclusion, it's naive to suggest that stakeholders and customer requests with their authority and power and understanding of the market can be ignored, or even shouldn't be a major part of your product investment. The key is to strike a balance between those inputs and the other inputs, and to make sure that you're applying the same level of critique and assessment to those ideas as any others. Secondly, when faced with lots and lots of data, just ask yourself where the absence of data might be. You're not going to be able to fill in all the gaps. Go get what you can and keep that in the mind so you don't fall into survivor bias. And encourage a psychologically safe environment as best you can. Hypothesis-led learning, calculated risk-taking, and celebrate those wins and failures. And as a product leader, never forget that saying, "I'm wrong," is powerful leadership. So, look out for your business voltmeters and keep those shocks down low. Despite those bullet-ridden planes coming back, be aware that there may be many more at the bottom of the oceans that you've missed. Protect the psychological safety of your team above all other attributes, more so than process, more so than roles, more so than goals. So you encourage them to thrive and challenge you and each other while they're working in their learning zone. And most of all, watch out for those straw men. They're scaring away better ideas and more powerful solutions. If you'd like to discover more techniques successful product managers employ, please pick up a copy of my book, The Influential Product Manager, or contact me here for a sample.